Welcome back to this History Book Club reading of The Kennedys After Camelot by J. Randy Taraborelli. I'm your host, Lori Spencer, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about the family feud between the Kennedys and the Shrivers. It's quite a lot of drama that unfolded mostly behind the scenes, away from the news cameras, which is why most people don't know about it, unless they're Kennedy family insiders or historians. And that's why I just love J. Randy Taraborelli's books about the Kennedys. Not only has he cultivated a lot of sources within the Kennedy clan over the last 30 years that he's been writing about them, but he's just meticulous in his research. He's always accurate. I very rarely have to stop and correct his work because he just gets his facts straight. He's not a worshiper of the Kennedys, nor is he a hater. And I think his greatest gift is how he humanizes all of the various characters in these stories, even certain members of the family who we might not always hold in the highest regard, or those who have behaved badly, shall we say. J. Randy Taraborelli really conveys that human fallibility, showing us once again, as we see so often in our study of history, that great men and great women have great flaws. We tend to associate the Kennedys and the Shrivers in our collective consciousness as one big happy family, two branches of a big family tree that go together like peanut butter and jelly, all working together for the public good. While that has often been true, especially in the third generation of Kennedys and Shrivers who get along a lot better than their parents did, the truth of the matter is that these two families are very distinct, very different from one another, and often with differing visions of what is best for the country. And we all see that playing out right now in 2025 as President Trump's health secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is dismantling and defunding a lot of the Great Society and War on Poverty programs that the Shrivers built. It's my view, personally, just as a Kennedy family historian, that some of this is more personal than political, that RFK Jr. is deliberately taking aim at the Shriver legacy in choosing which grants and programs to cut. There's a long history there, as you'll hear in this episode. The animosity between the Shrivers and the Kennedys really started after the assassination of President Kennedy, not before. The reason? Rather than resigning, as many of JFK's new frontiersmen eventually did, Sergeant Shriver stayed on in President Lyndon Johnson's administration to head the War on Poverty programs, and later serving as LBJ's ambassador to France. Sarge was also being considered as a possible running mate to LBJ during the 1964 presidential campaign, and this absolutely infuriated Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who naturally felt that he should have been next in line for that job. Even though RFK and LBJ couldn't stand each other, both knew that an LBJ-RFK ticket would never work. Nonetheless, Bobby felt betrayed by Sarge, and so did his wife, Ethel, and boy, could they ever hold a grudge. It also just so happened that the timing of Sarge being offered the ambassadorship to France coincided with the launch of RFK's 1968 presidential campaign. Sergeant Shriver choosing LBJ's ambassadorship instead of staying in the States to help Bobby's campaign only deepened that resentment that the Kennedys, especially RFK and Ted Kennedy, felt towards Sarge, and even their own sister Eunice, Sarge's wife. She felt the fire of their fury too. After Bobby's assassination, Ethel Kennedy never got over her anger at Sarge, passing it down to her children, including, of course, Health Secretary RFK Jr. Let's just say he was never a fan of Sergeant Shriver or even Eunice Kennedy, and the feeling was often mutual. After their son, Bobby Shriver, got busted for marijuana possession along with RFK Jr. when they were in their teens, the Shrivers pretty much forbade their kids from having any contact with RFK Jr. They thought he was obviously a bad influence, and he was persona non grata in the Shriver home for many, many years. Back in episode 3 of After Camelot, we explored those events and all of the nastiness between the Kennedys and the Shrivers in those chaotic years of the 1960s. So if you want the full backstory, be sure to go check out episode 3. Also, if you're interested in the current day feud between the Kennedys, the Shrivers, and Secretary of Health Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I recommend listening to episode 20 of my podcast series, The Dark Side of RFK Jr., where we cover that fascinating menagerie in depth. Today, we're going to spill the tea on how the Kennedys sabotaged Sergeant Shriver's presidential ambitions, both in 1972 and 76, and of the many internal family squabbles over money, power, and control of the all-important legacy that continues to this very day. Before we get started, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and if you're enjoying this History Book Club, share that playlist link, which is in the description, with anyone you know who's interested in the Kennedys. Hosting these book clubs is really just a fun hobby for me as a history buff, but it does consume quite a bit of labor and time putting all this together. So if you'd like to show me some love for my hard work, you can send me a super chat or a super thanks donation down in the comments, or buy me a book from my wish list at giftapp.com/reallaurie and I'll consider it for a future book club series. And because this is a huge book, 600-page book, obviously I'm not reading the whole thing in this book club. I'm just picking some selected excerpts, some of the spicy bits. And the way I'm going to do this episode, we're going to jump around a bit if you're following along with me. In the hardcover edition of After Camelot, I'm just trying to focus on the stories about the Kennedys and the Shriver relationships. So I'm going to take you all the way from 1968 through old age and death, okay? So we're going to cover a lot of territory in this reading today. So we're going to start on page 162, part 7, Sergeant Tries Again. Always in the way. Despite their utter disappointment about what happened in 1968, Sergeant and Eunice Shriver made the very best of their lives in Paris as he began his work as ambassador there, and Eunice continued her philanthropy with organizations for the mentally retarded, even starting some of her own charities in France. Of course, the Shrivers would still spend a great deal of time in America, but they worked to make Paris feel like home. As soon as they showed up in Paris, the estate where the ambassador and his family customarily lived was transformed into a mini timber lawn. On any given day, one might find mentally handicapped children running all over the place, mingling with important diplomats, with Eunice chasing after them and trying to get them into the pool for swimming lessons. Sergeant, always good-natured, could only shrug and say, "Welcome to my world." Within a very short time, Sergeant and Eunice became sort of royalty in Paris, attending all of the most important galas, rubbing elbows with the society's creme de la creme, international celebrities and government officials, and representing America as only they could. One year, Paris Match even named Sergeant one of the 5 most popular people in France. It wasn't to last, though. In 1970, Sergeant resigned his position as ambassador, due in part to his growing dissatisfaction with President Richard Nixon's politics and his policy on Vietnam that kept the war just raging on with seemingly no end in sight. Of course, as soon as Sergeant announced his resignation, Democratic leaders began circling to discuss the chances of his running for president in 1972. In what by now seemed like a well-rehearsed script, the Kennedys quickly began spreading the word that if Shriver did in fact run, it would appear to them and to their constituents that he was taking advantage of Ted Kennedy's recent scandal at Chappaquiddick. "It never ends," a frustrated Eunice said at the time to a friend of many years. "There's always going to be some reason Sarge shouldn't run. I'm just so tired of it." It had gotten to the point where Sergeant and Eunice didn't even feel comfortable anymore at the Kennedy compound, Senator George Smathers would recall. Whenever they were present, there always seemed to be contention about one statement or another Sarge had made in some speech that might have telegraphed his interest in running in 1972. Ted hadn't made up his mind yet about whether or not he was interested in a 72 campaign. In fact, he was still sure that there was no way America would allow him to forget Chappaquiddick long enough for him to run a successful campaign. However, he wanted to keep his options open, just as he wished to keep it open for 76, too. In other words, Sergeant Shriver was still in the way. I think Ted and some others might have liked it if Shriver just got out of politics altogether, to be candid, said Pierre Salinger. His presence being an issue every 4 years had begun to cause serious problems in the family. In fact, Eunice and Ethel weren't even on speaking terms for much of 1971, because Eunice was convinced that Ethel still harbored a resentment against her husband and was working behind the scenes to help orchestrate a campaign against him within the family. Another issue was that Sarge had a lot of unanswered questions about Chappaquiddick, said an anonymous source who knew him very well. He felt that Ted got away with something there, and maybe he should have had just a little more humility going forward. He said to me, the fact that he didn't go to the very first house with lights on and say, "Jesus Christ, a girl is drowning. Come and help me," is very suspicious to me. It looks like he was just trying to save his skin. I just think he could have been a more gracious person, considering how lucky he was to get out of that mess. In the end, Sarge felt the whole Chappaquiddick matter was badly handled anyway. He thought the arrival of all the Kennedy acolytes, of which he wasn't one, to the compound was a terrible idea that over-dramatized the matter, as he put it. If it were him, he said, not that he ever would have found himself in such a jam to begin with, he would have sat down in the privacy of his study, come to terms with what had happened, prayed about how to proceed, and then he would have written a heartfelt speech himself. He would have then delivered it to the American public in as sincere a manner as possible. The fact that he had to have all those people writing that speech for him, I think that was insane, he later said. I just don't understand that. Making matters worse, as far as Sarge was concerned, was that a few weeks after the Chappaquiddick accident, Ted flew to Paris to visit with his sister Eunice at the ambassador's residence. Was he the least bit contrite, or humble, or sad, or apologetic, or anything? Sarge asked. No, he drank the whole time, was drunk and disruptive. As it happened, the Shrivers had another visitor at the same time, Herbert Kramer, a publicist and speechwriter with whom they were working on a Special Olympics project. Eunice and Sarge were embarrassed by Ted's behavior in front of Kramer. Here we had a man Ted didn't even know who was a guest in our home, and Ted was treating the place like a big frat pad. I swear I wanted to punch his lights out, Sarge said to his friend. He was definitely not a big fan of Ted Kennedy at that time. Sargent now felt that he needed some time away from the political arena and away from the Kennedy family, too, which is why he decided to go into private law practice in 1971 with the large corporate firm of Strasser, Spiegelberg, Fried, Frank, and Kampelman, which, with the addition of Shriver to its ranks and the subtraction of a few others, became Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson. While he was with the firm, Shriver's biggest client was the billionaire financier Armand Hammer. Still, politics was in Shriver's blood, and he couldn't deny it. I felt that he wasn't in his element, said one of the attorneys who worked with Shriver at the firm. I had known Sarge for a number of years. He'd always had a glint in his eye, but I noticed it was gone when he was with that firm. I feel that God has a bigger mission in mind for me than what I can do here, he told me one day. I'm a public servant. That's who I am. I have to get back to it or I'm just not going to be happy. He said that Eunice was fine with him being out of politics, though. It has put her in a bad position with her family for such a long time. I can't blame her for wanting a break from it, he told me. But she's a tough bird, he added. Can you imagine her as First Lady? He asked, laughing. The entire country would be volunteering for one thing or another, and she'd be at their doors dragging them out of bed in the morning. As it would happen, Sergeant Shriver would get his moment in the sun in 1972. That was the year the Democratic presidential ticket, George McGovern and Thomas Eagleton, would self-destruct with the revelation that Eagleton had battled manic depression for much of his life, had been hospitalized for it, and had even undergone electroshock treatments. He had to drop out of the race. It was then that the party turned to Sergeant Shriver. Of course, some felt that Ted, as the last remaining Kennedy brother, should have been the logical choice to head the ticket, but he opted out of the primary process, saddled as he was with the negative fallout from Chappaquiddick. His absence left the field wide open for McGovern at the Democratic convention. Though he was an effective politician in the halls of Congress and on the floor of the Senate, McGovern was a dour, colorless candidate. He needed that old Kennedy magic, that much was certain. Therefore, he was relentless in his pursuit of Ted Kennedy to join his ticket as his running mate when he had to get rid of Eagleton. In rejecting the offer, Ted insisted he still needed, quote, breathing room to gain some experience and also help to raise his murdered brother's children. He didn't publicly cite memories of Chappaquiddick as being an issue, but privately he said that he believed Americans had still not gotten over any of it. George McGovern knew he needed a spark for his uphill run for the White House, but the truth was that pretty much no one of merit wanted to be on the ticket with him. 5 politicians had already turned him down. When Sergeant Shriver's name was floated as a possibility, it certainly seemed valid, but as it happened, the main reason he ended up on the ticket was because he was one of the only people who'd been approached who would actually agree to do it. From the start, it seemed like a bad idea to those who truly cared about Sergeant Shriver. The ticket was such a hopeless cause. No one could understand why he would ever want to hitch himself to its wagon. Still, it was his decision to do. Now, as ever, the question remained, what would Senator Ted Kennedy do? And how would the Kennedy family work for, or would they be against, Sergeant Shriver? Eunice Kennedy Shriver had to admit to some ambivalence about Sargent's decision to join the McGovern ticket as vice president. Yes, it was his time, as far as she was concerned. It had been his time for many years. But was this particular race worthy of him? It was all so troubled and hopeless seeming. She wasn't certain he should even be involved in it. In fact, she felt just barely inspired enough by it to appeal to Ted to please stay out of Sargent's way this time. In her meeting with Ted about the matter at his home in Boston, Ted nonchalantly said, "Okay, fine. I've got no problem with it, in fact. Tell Sarge he has my blessing." Though Eunice said she appreciated Ted's approval, in truth, it must have felt like a bit of a hollow victory. Of course, Ted had no problem with it. He and just about every Kennedy loyalist was certain that George McGovern would lose the race anyway, so what did they care? In fact, if that happened, it could very well not only taint Shriver in 72, but make him damaged goods for 76 as well, and all the better for Ted. Therefore, in a very real sense, Ted was getting exactly what he always wanted, which was, at long last, Sergeant Shriver finally out of the way. It felt unfair, said Eunice's former assistant. Not surprisingly, considering her loyalty to the senator, we also learned that Ethel Kennedy felt the same way about Sargent's running, her being sure, yeah, why not? Suddenly, both key Kennedys were okay with Mr. Shriver in a campaign. And then we also heard that Kennedy advisors Kenny O'Donnell, Ted Sorensen and the rest had also said, "Fine, no problem, lots of luck." It was also transparent. While it may have seemed a bad decision to some observers, Sergeant Shriver had his own reasons for wanting to join the Democratic ticket that year. First of all, he was as much a loyalist as he was an idealist. He could see very clearly the Democratic Party was going down in flames, and he didn't want that to happen. He believed his party needed him, and any time Shriver was truly needed, he wanted to be of assistance. Also, he reasoned that perhaps his party would repay his loyalty in 1976 and might see fit to nominate him that year on his own merits, and that, if so, maybe the Kennedy factor then wouldn't matter as much. Moreover, he felt that by entering the race, he could prove himself to be a strong campaigner, and that the reputation he built in 1972 might work to his political advantage in 1976. He felt he needed more visibility among his constituents, never having held elected office before, and that the campaign with McGovern might assist him in that regard. Moreover, he actually thought it possible that McGovern could win. Yes, the poll numbers were weak and the press had been terrible, yet stranger things had happened in politics, he reasoned. And besides, there were still 3 months left before the election. That could be time enough to galvanize the support the ticket desperately needed. He wasn't so naive as to think that Ted Kennedy's approval was based on anything other than Ted believing Shriver was going to go down in defeat. But it was an approval just the same, observed Senator George Smathers, Ted Kennedy's close friend. So he decided to run with it. And so it was that Sergeant Shriver and his impeccable blue ribbon credentials as a social activist entered the presidential campaign in 1972, hoping that he might be elected to the second highest office in the land, the office which Adlai Stevenson first described in 1952, referring to Richard Nixon, as being just a heartbeat away from the presidency. After the official nomination, Shriver's acceptance speech was filled with the kind of optimism and dynamism that had characterized his personality for years, not to mention the humor. Quote, "I am not embarrassed to be George McGovern's 7th choice for vice president," he said. "We Democrats might be short on money, but we're not short on talent. We've got Ted Kennedy, Ed Muskie, Hubert Humphrey, Abe Ribicoff, Tom Eagleton. What a galaxy of stars. Pity Mr. Nixon. His first and only choice was Spiro Agnew." Sargent also couldn't resist cracking a joke about Ted Kennedy, who was sitting nearby. "The great Ted Kennedy. I wonder what he's thinking about," he said, to a great laugh from the convention audience. A lot of other people wondered, too, what Teddy was thinking, especially when promises of campaign funding from the Kennedys did not come through as expected. The ticket was in serious financial straits from the very beginning, and it was clear that the Kennedys were not going to be helping at all. In retrospect, it would seem that George McGovern's campaign was pretty much doomed the moment he flip-flopped on Eagleton. One day he was for him, 1,000%, even in light of the revelations about him, and 5 days later, Eagleton was out, journalist Hugh Sidey recalled. It made McGovern look as if he didn't know what he was doing, and why hadn't he more thoroughly checked out Eagleton's past history anyway? It was a sore subject that colored the rest of the entire campaign. Of course, there were other significant problems too, not the least of which was just a general sense of disorganization in the ticket. Sergeant Shriver was a multitasker long before that term became part of the pop culture vernacular, who never knew how to prioritize his schedule, and no one who worked for him was able to assist him in that regard. He was hard to manage, said Donald Dell, who worked for the campaign in its earlier days, maintaining the schedule of events. He was a wonderful man who wanted to do good things and be all things to all people, and that kind of politician is difficult to control. I could never get him where he needed to be because he was always off doing something else he felt was important. I used to say, if we had 10 sergeants, this would work. But one is not enough. There was constant disarray. Besides a matter of finances and scheduling, there was a huge controversy over whether or not Nixon had blown the Paris peace talks, continued Dell, which pitted Sarge against President Nixon in a very acrimonious way. Sarge said a lot of unkind things about Nixon, suggesting in his speeches that he was a crook, a liar, and worse. President Nixon retaliated by trying to undermine Sarge's reputation and his knowledge of the peace talks. It seems hard to believe now, but at the time, Nixon was very popular. People tended to believe him. Still, though most polls predicted that the Democrats would go down in the worst defeat in modern American politics, which they did, there was Sergeant Shriver on the front lines, always believing there to be an upswing in support of the McGovern-Shriver ticket. You just can't predict these things, he said at the time. You have to roll with the punches. With his patrician way, outfitted in banker's tailoring, Sarge was a tireless spokesman for a renewed liberalism. His charisma and Kennedy-like demeanor, very hard to resist. Newspaper columnist Mary McGrory assessed it this way. To rouse his audience, he does everything but administer open-heart massage. Meanwhile, McGovern, downbeat and dispirited, failed to galvanize much support during the 3-month campaign. Stanley Karnow of the Washington Post noted, quote, although there is nothing less prestigious than running for the vice presidency on a weak team, Sergeant Shriver is probably the most sparkling of the 4 candidates on the electoral race. In contrast to George McGovern, whose nasal piety borders on the self-righteous, Shriver exudes a natural sense of humor that seems to suggest that he considers the election as just a game, even if he is playing to win. Also playing to win was Eunice. She had finally decided that she would give her all to this campaign. And once she made that decision, there was no stopping her. Not only did she make campaign forays on her own, but she and Sarge as a team spent 15-hour days crisscrossing the campaign trail in search of voters for the McGovern-Shriver ticket. She was a force of nature out there, said Doris Kearns Goodwin, the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and presidential historian who worked in a public relations capacity for the Shriver team. There was nothing she would not do, Doris said, knocking on doors, handing out flyers, speaking to a small group of women, shaking hands with factory workers. She would do it all with that characteristic Kennedy flair and so much energy, you just wondered where it all came from. Frustrating for Eunice, though, was the ever lackadaisical support from the rest of the Kennedy family. Of course, they made some obligatory appearances, Ted and Joan, Rose, and even Ethel, but they seemed pretty half-hearted. There wasn't much sparkle from any of them, especially not from Ethel, and Eunice felt the strong sting of their rejection. She didn't focus on it, though. There was a lot to do, and she wanted to do it all, as always, but she was very unhappy with the family, especially given all that Sarge had done for them in the past. It was disappointing. The strongest family support the Shrivers received was from Jackie and Aristotle Onassis, who donated a large sum of money to the campaign. This came as a surprise because Eunice and Sarge hadn't had much patience for Jackie's relationship with Ari. However, in recent months, Eunice and Jackie had begun speaking about it, and Eunice had apologized for having been so chilly. It was as if now she more fully understood what it was like to be on the outside looking in, and she wanted to make amends to Jackie and Ari. In return, Jackie made a number of campaign appearances for Sarge and spoke well of him every chance she got. Characteristically, Shriver sent her and Ari a note a week after the election in 1972 to show his appreciation. Both Eunice and I are grateful for all of your encouragement and support during these past months, and it gives us comfort to know you're thinking of us now. As a postscript, Shriver added, Jackie, you were so solicitous and sensitive to my situation that I must add a note of special thanks. The loss was a big one, in fact, maybe even bigger than expected. Friends, business associates, and dozens of others came together at Timberlawn to watch the poll results on election night, which, from the beginning, Eunice knew would be shattering. "This will be a hell of a night," she said. "The first time a Kennedy loses an election." In the end, Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew would go on to win that election by an overwhelming landslide. Nixon won 60% of the popular vote and 520 electoral votes to McGovern's 17. Unbelievably, Nixon carried 49 of the 50 states, with only Massachusetts coming through for McGovern-Shriver. It was difficult to imagine a bigger defeat in any major election. "Well, we did our best," Sergeant Shriver said that night. "We didn't have the support I had hoped for, I must admit. But you can't take these things personally. You give it your best shot. That's all you can do. That's what Eunice and I did." Though he put on a brave face in public, privately, Sergeant Shriver was crushed by his recent loss. It would take him years to get over it, if he ever actually did. It wasn't so much the election. That was politics, and he understood it was all a game anyway, a high-stakes one, true, but a game just the same. What really bothered him was the way the Kennedys, and especially his brother-in-law Ted, had let him down. A friend of some years' standing tells the story to this author of a meeting he had with Sargent about a month after the election. The two were at the Kennedy compound in the living room of the big house. "I don't feel very much at home here these days," Sargent said, according to his friend's account of the conversation. "I try to be above it, but I admit I'm pretty pissed off." "Hey, you have a right to be pissed off," his friend told him. "Look, they screwed you over, Sarge. That's clear." Shriver nodded. "But I'm trying to rise above it," he said. "It's my wife's family. What the hell can I do?" "You can be pissed. That's what you can do," his friend said. "Why take the high road all the time, Sarge? It's never done you any good in this goddamn society of Kennedys." "I know," Sargent agreed, "but I have a responsibility to my kids to handle this thing the right way." The two men smiled at each other. "Same old Sarge," his friend said. And now we're going to skip forward in the book, if you're reading along with me, to page 220, part 11, Shriver for President. An old saw alleges that once you dip your toe into the roiling waters of politics, the longing for a full-on dive into the swirling eddy is too difficult to resist. It turned out to be all too true with Sergeant Shriver, as he announced his decision to seek his party's nomination for president in 1976. However, as has always been the case, his affiliation with the Kennedy family did him no favors. Of course, Sarge first had to make sure the coast was clear where Ted Kennedy was concerned. As he did every 4 years now, Ted vacillated between running and waiting, and, as also seemed to be the case every 4 years, expected Shriver just to wait for his decision. But eventually, Ted made a firm choice not to run in 1976, clearing the way for Sargent. When Shriver and Kennedy met to discuss Shriver's entering the race, Sarge put it to Teddy straight. "Look, if you're not going to run, what about me?" In a response that was one step removed from being niggardly, Ted said, "I wish you well." Hardly a ringing endorsement. Ted said he wouldn't oppose Shriver's running for president, but that Sargent shouldn't expect a lot of help from him either. Shriver had never before sought political office on his own, and he called his decision a leap of faith. However, he couldn't seem to make up his mind about whether he wanted to play off the obvious Kennedy connection. On one hand, I think Sarge hoped to establish his identity independent of his famous family, recalled Hugh Sidey, but on the other, he felt that the Kennedy name might go a long way towards helping to reinforce his own credibility. In the end, he decided to go with the Kennedy connection. Thus, when Sarge made his announcement, the Kennedys showed up in full force to at least appear to be supportive. Rose, Ethel, Pat, Joan, and Jean were present, and all had signed on as members of the Shriver for President Committee, with Jackie joining in as well. I'm fortified by my family, by my mother, who has seen 23 presidential campaigns, by my wife, Eunice, and our sons and daughter, by my brother Herbert, by Rose Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy, and Jackie, by Jean and Pat and Joan, and my most admirable sister-in-law, Willa Shriver of Baltimore, Shriver said in his announcement speech, notably leaving out Ted's name. In peace and war, in public and private life, they know the demands and duties, the joys and sorrows of the kind of course I'm taking, and have encouraged me to take it. During his speech, Shriver also invoked the name of JFK and tried to establish that clear connection between himself and the late president's ideals. Let us remember there is no conservative or liberal remedy for the sickness of the national spirit, he intoned. The cure will come from honest, truthful leadership that summons the best in us, as we remember John Kennedy once did. His legacy awaits the leader who can claim it. I intend to claim it, not for myself alone, but for the family that first brought it into being, for the millions who joyfully and hopefully entered public service in those days in order to produce a better life for all, and to those billions of unknown, uncounted human beings whom I've seen all over the world, in Asia, South America, Western Europe, and the Soviet Union, for whom the memory of those days and of John Kennedy is still an inspiration to their minds and a lift to their hearts. That's what we must all be proud of once again. It was pretty stunning rhetoric, but as it would happen, perhaps a mistake for Shriver to connect himself so closely to JFK. The presence of the Kennedy women on stage, as well as the reference to JFK, suggested that Shriver didn't have his own platform on which to stand, but was instead trying to create some sort of allusion to Camelot. It wasn't like he had much choice, though, because when he tried to distance himself from the family, a reporter would inevitably corner Ted Kennedy to get a comment from him, and that comment would usually end up working against Shriver, recalled Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Though Ted watched the proceedings from a safe distance, I think maybe the idea that Sargent might become president was a little more than he could handle. In fact, Ted couldn't contain his professional jealousy. He still believed that if there was going to be a president or vice president in the family, it should be he, and if not he, then no one else. At one point, Ted even told a reporter, "I can't help it if Sargent wants to run." When asked if he supported him, he said, "Yeah, sure, I'll support him." The reporter wasn't convinced. "If Mussolini was running, would you support him too?" Ted laughed. "Yes, if he was married to my sister," he answered. Indeed, the Massachusetts senator was always at the ready with a lacerating quip when the subject of a rivalry between Sergeant Shriver and himself was broached. Unfortunately, after Sarge made his announcement that he would be campaigning for a place on the Democratic ticket, the Kennedys made a hasty exit from his campaign and were rarely seen again. "I'm waiting for Ted to run," Jean's husband, Stephen Smith, told one Politico when asked why he wasn't more involved in the Shriver campaign. When told that Ted wasn't planning to run in '76, Smith said, "I'm still waiting for Ted to run." "I think it's just awful," Jackie Kennedy Onassis told Stephen Smith in the presence of two mutual friends and two business associates during a meeting in New York. The small group was in Smith's New York office, discussing certain stocks her children had in common with the Kennedy family when the subject of the Shriver campaign was raised. Jackie was unafraid to speak her mind on such matters, especially when they involved Sargent. About a year earlier, in April 1975, Eunice thought it would be fun if Jackie allowed John and Caroline to go to Russia with the Shrivers for a vacation. Jackie agreed, but because Caroline had other summer plans, John went alone. While John was with the Shrivers, Sargent spent many hours telling him long and detailed stories about his father, the president. So much so that by the time John got back to the States, he had a whole new respect and admiration for his dad. That Sarge had taken so much time with her son made Jackie love him all the more. "This family is acting like some kind of cult, and I'm very disappointed," Jackie told Stephen Smith. "Sarge is such a good man," she said. "It's a real shame." Smith disagreed. "Obviously, Teddy does not want him to run," he said. "So I don't understand why Sarge keeps injecting himself every 4 years. He's so stubborn. He just wants what he wants," Smith said, getting heated. "Well, it doesn't matter," he concluded, "because it's Teddy who will always have the last word." Now Jackie was upset too. "It's Teddy who wants what he wants, and at the expense of everyone else," she exclaimed. Jackie added that it was well known within the family that deep down, Ted did not want to be president, nor did he want to be vice president. But Sarge wanted it badly, she said, and he was qualified to do it and deserved to do it, at least in her opinion. And not only that, she concluded, this country needs him. Stephen Smith just shrugged and said that the two would have to agree to disagree. "I can tell you this much, the family will never support Sarge running for president or vice president," he said. "Even if Teddy runs, wins, and serves 2 terms, and Sarge then wants to run, the family will still not support it." With that, Jackie's eyes widened. According to the witnesses, she stood up and demanded to know of Smith, "Since when do you speak for the whole family? I happen to be a part of this family, and you do not speak for me." She then turned and walked out of the room without so much as a goodbye. And I'm just going to pause here for a moment to point out that I just finished a biography series on this channel about JFK Jr.'s life and times, which some of you might find interesting if you haven't listened to it yet. In that podcast series, we go deep into that trip to Russia, which was so interesting with the Shrivers. And also, John became very close friends with his cousin Timothy Shriver on that trip to Russia. A year later, summer of '76, I think it was, Sargent asked Jackie if, in the true Kennedy tradition of service, she would allow John, who was then 15, to accompany 16-year-old Timothy Shriver to Central America to help the Peace Corps after a massive earthquake there. And that's another really interesting story that we tell. I won't spend time on it here in this episode because I covered it so much in the JFK Jr. series, but you can find that playlist. I'll put a link down in the comments. It's called JFK Jr., The Man Behind the Myth. And if you've ever been curious to know about his life, I think you would enjoy that. Okay, back to the book. We are on page 224. As much as Jean Kennedy avoided taking any role in the family's high-profile and very public political activities, her husband Stephen did not shy away from the Kennedy spotlight. He was especially unhappy with the attention being heaped on one person whom he seemed intent on casting as a rival, Eunice's husband, Sergeant Shriver. If Sarge ever considered Stephen at all, it would certainly not be as a potential rival for the public and family's approval. When Sarge left his position as managing director of the Merchandise Mart to join JFK's administration, Smith was chosen to replace him at the Mart. In addition, Stephen handled the Kennedy family's extensive real estate and financial holdings, and from all accounts did a superior job. Sarge was always complimentary of Stephen's work, but it has to be said that seldom was the reverse true. The brothers-in-law just didn't get along, mainly because Stephen had such a dim view of Sarge's desire to be a politician, and was doubtless jealous of the high regard in which many in the family held Shriver. Although Sergeant and Eunice Shriver hit the campaign trail vigorously on Sarge's behalf, they simply couldn't get any traction there. It was very difficult for Eunice, said Senator George Smathers. Weekends at the Kennedy compound had never been more tense, I can tell you that much. To be honest, I think Eunice didn't even have her heart in it, though. I think she almost feared what fresh hell her life would be if Sarge actually won the nomination. And who knows what her family would have done if he'd won the election. I think she could look into the future and see nothing but heartaches. And she made a decision, even if she never gave voice to it, that she would just as soon Sarge not get the nomination. I'm sure there were times when Eunice wished that Sargent was tougher, meaner, more of a bulldog, said Pierre Salinger. But that wasn't his way. He was a gentleman, a diplomat. Shriver could look at a problem from every angle and consider it to the conclusion that there were no good guys and bad guys taking part in it. Situations were not as black and white for him as they were for the other Kennedy men. Whereas JFK and RFK had staunch allies and enemies, Shriver had staunch enemies who were often also allies. In many ways, I think the Kennedys actually appreciated Shriver's sense of diplomacy and his even-tempered approach, and with the passing of years, they had repeatedly used it to their advantage. But that didn't mean they respected it. He was a nice guy, and you know what they say about nice guys? Salinger concluded. It's reductive and not even true to say that Shriver finished last, but he didn't always finish first, that's for sure. As it turned out, Sergeant Shriver did not secure his party's nomination in 1976. Instead, the Democrats went for the virtually unknown Jimmy Carter to head the party's ticket. In the post-Watergate era, with Nixon leaving office in disgrace, it was as if the country simply wasn't interested in high-profile, controversial figures anymore, especially those who couldn't seem to get along without their high-profile, controversial family members. To a large extent, the public and the media had grown weary of the persistent Kennedy question as it applied to Sergeant Shriver, whether the family was in or out, whether Ted cared or didn't, and on and on. Such an ongoing narrative just made Sergeant Shriver look as if he wasn't his own man. A lot of people thought I was just an in-law trying to capitalize on my relationship with the Kennedys, Sargent told the Chicago Tribune in 1987. And who in the hell wants to have an in-law of the Kennedys? If you want to have someone who stands for what the Kennedys stand for, you want a Kennedy. They thought I was running for president on the basis of the fact that I was related, and the public thought, what a cheap, low-level kind of thing that was. Even after Jack was killed, I was the brother-in-law of the former president of the United States, or I was the brother-in-law of the attorney general, or the brother-in-law of the senator. You're always devalued. There were times I'd say to myself, wouldn't it be great if I could just get out from under all this and be myself? Yes, there were other problems with Sarge's 1976 campaign related to philosophical issues such as his apparent waffling on the subject of abortion. He and Eunice were definitely pro-life, though at times his speeches seemed to indicate otherwise. However, by far the biggest obstacle Sergeant Shriver faced in his 1976 bid for the presidential nomination was the same one that had dogged him in 1964, in 1968, and in 1972. And it wasn't just the public's perception of his relationship to the Kennedys, as Sarge so very diplomatically outlined to the Chicago Tribune. It was that the Kennedys and their acolytes really and truly did not want him to succeed where Ted hadn't yet. It was as simple as that. Certainly, one would think that there should have been a place in American politics for a noble man like Sergeant Shriver, a visionary, an idealistic thinker whose own brand of philanthropy had nothing to do with money or worldly possessions, but everything to do with his wealth of ideas in contributing to the public good. It wasn't meant to be, though. 1976 would bring the election of Jimmy Carter over Gerald Ford. Meanwhile, Ted Kennedy was that same year re-elected to the Senate, and so it remains for Sarge's firstborn and namesake, Bobby Shriver, to sum up during an interview what happened to his dad in that bicentennial year. He said, quote, "Ted didn't do shit for my father in 1976. And we're going to skip forward now to page 284, part 14, Kennedy Upheaval. By the spring of 1984, the 4 surviving children of Joe and Rose Kennedy, Eunice, Pat, Jean, and Ted, were concerned, and some might say with very good reason, that the next generation of Kennedys, their children, the 3rd generation, would never be able to live up to the standards set not only by the adults but also by history. Most of the members of that 3rd generation simply weren't interested in any of the Kennedy charities, most notably the Kennedy Foundation, which, under Eunice's leadership, had taken on the cause of mental retardation. Eunice and Sargent's 4 children were heavily invested, but it's not as if they had much choice. "These are important times," Eunice wrote in one of her many missives to her son Bobby in 1984. "We cannot, we must not squander these opportunities for growth and for a fuller and deeper understanding of mental retardation and all that it involves. I implore you, as I do your brothers and sister, to be involved. It is part of our mandate as Kennedys and Shrivers that we do all we can, give all of our time. Please plan your vacation this summer with my wishes in mind and those of your father. Love, Mother." One would have been hard-pressed to find other Kennedys as involved with the Kennedy Foundation as Eunice and Sargent's offspring were. Certainly Jackie's children, John Jr. and Caroline, had little to do with the foundation, just like most, if not all, of Ethel's children. Even Ted's children seemed pretty uninterested. "I have recently decided that this must change," Eunice said at a meeting at Ted's home on April 9th, 1984, according to the minutes of that meeting. Besides her and Sarge, also in attendance were her son Bobby, Pat Kennedy, Jean and Stephen Smith, Ted Kennedy, Ted's son, Ted Jr., Ethel, Ethel's sons, Joe and Bobby Jr., and half a dozen Kennedy Foundation employees and financial advisors such as Bob Cook and Joe Hackham. "I think we have to recognize that it can't just be me and Sarge forever running this foundation," Eunice told the others. "The next generation must come forth. This is a family matter, and I am now of the opinion that they must come forth now." "Well, I don't see how," Ethel said, "when, let's be honest, Eunice, you won't let anyone near the foundation, and certainly not the kids." "That is not true," Eunice shot back quickly, "and in fact, it's a complete mischaracterization of my role here, and you know it, Ethel." Others at the meeting recall these 2 women staring at each other for a long, tense moment. Then Eunice started angrily riffling through a gigantic leather portfolio full of memos and correspondence and other material relating to the foundation. "I have right here," she began, referring to one document in particular that she may have thought would prove something important. Ted cut his sister off in order to restore peace. "It is true," he said, according to the minutes, "that the next generation has not stepped forward in a timely fashion. I am not convinced, though, that the reasons for their lack of interest are as Ethy here has suggested. However, it would help, I think, if there was perhaps more transparency as to how the foundation is run." Eunice and Sargent just stared at Ted. Was he also suggesting that the Shrivers, and Eunice in particular, had commandeered the foundation? In truth, the Kennedy Foundation had always been Eunice's baby. Long before she started Camp Shriver, Eunice had wanted to transform the public's point of view about mental retardation, and in the process also be of assistance to the mentally handicapped. It may seem reductive to put it in these terms, but the truth is that, more than anything, she just wanted to make a difference. Because of her family's many connections, she had the power and influence to do so. Joe Kennedy sensed that all of his daughters, Eunice was the one who was the most astute, the most focused, and it's safe to say, the most like him. Therefore, her opinion mattered to him a great deal, and from 1947 on, she was very instrumental in advising him about the kinds of charities that she felt were most deserving of the Kennedys' interest and financial support. Of course, she wanted to prove to her father that she could do it, that she could, in fact, do anything he wanted her to do, and do it as well as any of his sons. But she also truly believed in the cause, and much of her emotional attachment to it had to do with the plight of her sister Rosemary. In the end, it's safe to say that if not for Eunice, the Kennedy Foundation never would have thrived. After all, it was her drive and passion that fueled its many, many projects, and it was because of her resolve and persistence that she was able to get legislation passed that would make significant changes in the way the government thought of and handled the plight of the mentally retarded. Ted said it best in a letter to Jean Kennedy Smith, dated March 1st, 1981, quote, "The Kennedys owe her a debt of gratitude that we as a family have been so associated with this cause as worthwhile." By the mid-1970s, though, Ted, Jean, and Pat, who were also trustees of the foundation, were pushing hard for it to begin supporting causes other than just mental retardation. At the time, the foundation's annual income was a little over $2 million, and Eunice wanted to spend all of it on causes related to mental retardation. But her siblings had other ideas. For instance, the John F. Kennedy Library needed help in organizing the hundreds of thousands of documents that were being stored there. The facility was greatly understaffed. Jean Kennedy felt strongly that some portion of the foundation's money should go to the library, and she even managed to get Jackie Kennedy's support in that regard, which under most circumstances would have all but guaranteed success for that venture, but not for this one. Eunice wasn't impressed with the idea, and Jackie's support of it meant little to her. "The library is its own entity," she wrote in a letter to Jean. "Perhaps money can be siphoned from the foundation's endowment for this purpose, but most certainly not from its annual income." Moreover, the properties on the Kennedy compound needed some structural work, and it was Pat who felt that some of the foundation's money should go to that purpose. Ethel, not a trustee of the foundation, but obviously a powerful family member, agreed with her. That proposition was unreasonable to Eunice, though. Home renovations did not fall under the purview of responsibilities of the Kennedy Foundation, at least not in her opinion. In the spring of 1977, Eunice met with Ted, Pat, and Jean at Jean and Stephen Smith's house in the compound to discuss the siblings' ideas for spending the foundation's money. In the minutes from that meeting, it's clear that Eunice would not be swayed from her point of view. She really could wear her siblings down if she chose to, and she chose to. At the meeting, no matter what the others came up with as a valid reason to spend money on something other than mental retardation, Eunice countered with an equally valid reason as to why the expenditure shouldn't occur. "Then it is decided," she said, even though it really wasn't, that $2.3 million will continue to be spent from the annual income for the mentally retarded. The others didn't say anything, but it's doubtful that they were completely happy. Eunice then ran from the Smiths' home over to Rose Kennedy's house, and that was quite a distance, to discuss the matter with her mother. She had such extraordinary energy and stamina that no one could keep up with her as she darted from one person's home in the compound to another's, taking care of important business as only she could. According to Eunice's notes, she spent, quote, considerable time with Rose that day, discussing with her what her siblings wished to do with the foundation's money and how she so vehemently disagreed with them. According to what Eunice later wrote, Rose confirmed for her that the foundation had been started specifically to help the retarded, and that its money should be spent only for that purpose and nothing else. With her mother's approval, Eunice then ran back over to the Smiths and told them that the family's matriarch agreed with her, and that was the end of it, for the time being anyway. By the fall of 1983, the Kennedy siblings again had other ideas for the Kennedy Foundation's money, and again the JFK Library and the Kennedy compound had come to their minds as projects to be taken seriously. Now they were also concerned about some structural repairs needed at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. One meeting at Ted's home in Virginia between himself, Pat, Jean, Stephen Smith, and Eunice and Sargent became particularly contentious, according to its minutes. "I'm sick and tired of the same old arguments," Eunice told her siblings. "Father's intention for the Kennedy Foundation was clear from the outset, and it was that mental retardation be at its forefront, not the restoration of any of the homes we own." Ted wasn't so sure. "I do not recall Father being quite so adamant," he said. "Well, I do," Eunice insisted. Actually, Eunice was stretching the truth. In fact, Joe Kennedy had started the Kennedy Foundation mainly as a tax shelter for the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, and it was Eunice who ended up using it as a way of furthering her own cause of mental retardation when she took it over in 1960. Joe was only mildly interested in the cause of mental retardation. It was Eunice who really propelled it forward, turning it into her life's work. That was the way it happened, but not the way Eunice chose to remember it. In fact, it was stipulated in Joe Kennedy's will that the Kennedy Foundation's money to be used to fulfill its dedicated purpose. Joe's will said nothing about mental retardation. As the meeting ended, the siblings were not happy with Eunice at all. Yet they were wondering if maybe she was right and they were wrong. That's how compelling Eunice was when it came to debating. A couple of weeks later, it was Bobby Shriver, instead of his parents, Eunice and Sarge, who met with Ted Kennedy, which suggests that animosity was definitely building again between Eunice and Ted. Ted and Bobby Shriver agreed that yet another meeting should be held to discuss the Kennedy Foundation, and at this next meeting, Ted said that he wanted to see some proof that his father's intention behind the foundation was that it be solely directed to the cause of mental retardation. According to a later recollection, when Bobby Shriver told his uncle that he was not comfortable going back to his parents with such a request, Teddy had to laugh. He probably knew what his nephew would be up against, and he felt badly for him, but it had to be done. At the same time that Eunice Kennedy Shriver was in discussions with her siblings over the business of the Joseph P. Kennedy Foundation, her husband, Sergeant Shriver, was dealing with a predicament of arguably much greater importance, a crisis that would provide him with an opportunity to once again consider his faith. When Sargent used to say that he had never been sick a day in his life, it wasn't just hyperbole. No one who knew him well recalled the man ever even having so much as a cold. That's why it was such a surprise in the fall of 1983 when he woke up in the middle of the night with a wrenching, searing pain in his abdomen. He was 68 at the time. Eunice was on a business trip, and the only other person in the house was his son Anthony. The pain was so severe, Sargent was not even able to get out of bed. Anthony had to pick him up and physically carry him downstairs, then put him in the car and drive him to Georgetown Hospital. After 2 weeks of tests, no one seemed to have a clue as to what the problem might be with Shriver, and it was decided that he, quote, probably had stomach cancer. More tests would have to be conducted, though, to be sure. So they decided I should go and see this top-notch cancer guy, Sargent told this author, J. Randy Taraborelli, many years ago, back in 2002. Can you imagine that there even is such a thing? A cancer guy? He asked, laughing. Of course, the Shriver family was greatly concerned about Sargent's health. However, to hear him tell it, he wasn't all that worried. Something just made me feel that I didn't have to be concerned, he said. So I went to see the cancer guy, and he did all of his tests, and sure enough, even he didn't know what was wrong except that I probably had cancer. I asked him what he knew for sure, and he said, "Nothing really. I just think we need to do more tests." But the timing was a little off, Sarge recalled with a laugh. You see, the cancer guy had to go to Hawaii for a medical convention, so he gave me a bag full of awful medications and said for me to take them and then come back to see him in a couple of weeks. I left there thinking, okay, so let me get this straight. The cancer guy is going to go on vacation, on a medical convention, and meanwhile, I have to sit home and have cancer? No, I decided, I'm not going to accept it. Sarge discussed it with Eunice, who simply could not reconcile the possibility that her husband had cancer. There's only one solution, she said. We have to pray, and we have to pray like we never prayed before, she said, according to his memory, because there is no way I will accept this. Of course, Sargent agreed with her. That day, Sarge, who had gone to church nearly every day of his adult life, went to his place of worship, Holy Trinity in Georgetown, the same church in which JFK had attended his last Mass before he was assassinated. Founded by the Jesuits in 1794 and administered by them ever since, it's the oldest Catholic church in the nation's capital. There, sitting in a wooden pew in an empty church, Sargent Shriver contemplated Jesus Christ's agony in the garden after the Last Supper. As described in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, during the agony in the garden, Christ's human will had to decide whether or not to submit to the divine will expressed by the Father's command that Jesus offer redemption to all of humanity through his painful and public death by crucifixion. Presumably, since Christ's human will was free, in his human nature, he did have a choice in this matter. His agony was that, as a human being, he did not want to suffer, just as no human being does. The point is important in the teaching of Christianity in that it suggests that Christ is not merely a distant deity, but also someone who deeply identifies with man's sufferings while remaining perfectly divine. In the end, despite his understanding of the suffering he would have to endure, Christ willingly submitted his human will to the command of his Father. Though there was no justification for the pain Jesus was to suffer, Sarge would later observe, he accepted it anyway. He didn't cry about it. He didn't whine about it. He didn't try to figure out a way around it. He just accepted it as God's will. And that day in church, I thought, hell, if he could accept death like that, then who am I not to accept whatever it is that's causing me this present problem? I sure as hell can do it if he did it. And I was thinking this thing over, really mulling it over, and something washed over me. It was a peace and calm such that I had never before experienced. I knew in that very moment that it didn't matter if I had cancer, and it didn't even matter if I didn't. I was fine. I knew I was perfect and whole no matter the outcome, that it didn't make any difference what was going on in my body. My soul was okay. And from that moment on, Sarge recalled, I am not kidding you, from that moment on, I began to feel a hell of a lot better. In fact, 2 weeks later, Sargent Shriver had never felt better in his life. The pain he'd had in his stomach was gone. He went back to the doctor, who conducted all of the tests Sarge had intended to take upon his return, and the results all came back negative. And I was sitting there in the doctor's office, Sargent recalled, and the doctor looked at me and said, Sarge, I don't know what you did, but you sure did it. "There's nothing wrong with you." I just looked at him and said, "I know, Doc. You're not telling me anything I don't know." And that was the end of it. Sergeant Shriver said he felt uncomfortable relaying this particular story, quote, "because the suggestion is that it's a big deal and the first time anything like that ever happened to me. In fact," he said, "I have many times in my life when I was saved, especially when I was in the service, times when everyone was killed in my unit but me, or times when I had escaped death just at the last minute. People ask me why I am so religious," he said. "It's because I have always just known that my faith protects not only me, but my family. All of us have felt the same way." And some might say, "Well, what about the Kennedy curse?" Shriver asked. To that, I say, we as a family have always believed that there's more to consider than just our human experience, something better, something richer and more important. And if we Kennedys and we Shrivers and we Smiths are in some way cursed to experience the hereafter just a little sooner than the rest of humanity, well then, so be it. That's how I look at the Kennedy curse anyway. So be it. Soon after Sergeant Shriver's health scare, the disagreements over the Kennedy Foundation continued. Bobby Shriver went back to his mother, Eunice, with Ted Kennedy's request of some proof that their father intended the foundation to focus its attention solely on the cause of mental retardation. Eunice was, not surprisingly, quite angry. "This again," she exclaimed, probably referring to the fact that the issue had been raised at the last meeting. "Does he think we are lying?" she asked her son. Bobby said his uncle just wants proof. As expected, that didn't sit well with Eunice at all. She got on the telephone with her brother and told him that the proof he wanted was not written. In fact, it was verbal. In many conversations that Joe Kennedy had with her and with Sargent, she said, the family patriarch made it quite clear that all of the money from the foundation should be used for the purpose of researching mental retardation. "It's what father wanted, and it's what mother wants," Eunice said, according to one recollection of the conversation. "And I am not going to stand by and allow the trustees," meaning her siblings, "to continue to question my own ethics or that of the foundation." In other words, she was sick of this debate and was not going to engage in it any longer. There were several more meetings, though, in late 1983, but Eunice would not be swayed by her siblings. It was finally becoming clear to them that even as trustees, they had no power to make decisions where the Kennedy Foundation was concerned. Or, as Ted put it in a letter to Sergeant Shriver at the time, quote, "I am sure my father intended for all of his children to take part in the decision-making process, and I am not sure that this is what has been occurring." Finally, in January 1984, Ted, Pat, and Jean shot off an angry letter to Eunice, telling her that, as far as they were concerned, the foundation was a family business, and as such, it should support all of the areas of philanthropy viewed worthwhile by the different members of the family. In other words, the foundation didn't belong to Eunice, it belonged to all of them. They still had the same goals in mind for the way the money should be spent, according to what they wrote to Eunice, namely the Kennedy Center, the Kennedy Library, work on the Kennedy compound, as well as several charities that interested Jean and Stephen Smith, such as Jean's own venture, the Very Special Arts. The siblings maintained that they were also unhappy about the way the Kennedy Library was being run as it related to researchers. Several Kennedy biographers had gotten hold of documents through the library that they were able to utilize in their work, books which the family did not approve, such as the aforementioned Kennedys, an American Drama by Horowitz and Collier, which they felt had just added to the myriad problems that young David Kennedy was experiencing. The Kennedy siblings wanted more restrictions placed on certain documents made available to researchers, which also meant a complete review of the library's holdings, and that was going to cost a lot of money. In Eunice's view, that concern was chiefly to do with protecting the family's image. It might have surprised outsiders to know that she couldn't have cared less about how the family was portrayed in books about them. Quote, "Do you think it matters in the least?" she would later say. "People will always write whatever they will write. We should be used to that by now." Her interest was in mental retardation, not family public relations. Now this thing, which had been brewing for years, had turned into a bit of a war. As far as Eunice Kennedy Shriver was concerned, the siblings, or trustees as they were referred to, were engaged in a mutinous battle against her. The only thing she agreed with them on was that the next generation should be brought into the decision-making process of the foundation. That was it, though. Everything else she disagreed with. Moreover, in her view, getting the next generation involved in the foundation's business wasn't going to happen overnight. It would likely take 5 to 10 years, she said. Eunice was now quite disenchanted with her siblings and wasn't very friendly to any of them from January to April of 1984, which brings us back to the meeting at Ted's house on April 9th, 1984. "I have changed my mind," Eunice announced at that meeting, "and I now think we should not wait 5 to 10 years to bring in the next generation. I think we should do it now." "Exactly," Ethel said. "That is what I've been saying all along." "I know that, Ethel," Eunice said. Then, as she scooped up a pile of papers and started busily inserting them into file folders in a large notebook, she added crisply, "And I am agreeing with you, all right? I will concede that point, but will not make any concessions as to how the foundation's money is spent." In other words, she was trying to strike a compromise by giving them something. Not much, though, since the real issue on the table wasn't really when the third generation would come into power, as much as it was the question of how the foundation's money was to be spent, just on mental retardation causes or on other charitable ventures as well. Since Ethel really had no knowledge of the back and forth about the foundation's expenditures because she was not a trustee, and this was one of the very rare meetings she even attended related to this matter, she didn't have much else to say. In the end, not surprisingly, Eunice prevailed. The trustees finally agreed with her that the Kennedy Foundation would continue to be devoted solely to the cause of mental retardation as long as the next generation would now be allowed to play a bigger role in its decision-making process. And that was fine with Eunice. It was substantially what she'd been fighting for anyway. It gave her more time to do what she wanted with the foundation's money without having to answer to her siblings about it. And the war was finally over. So what about that next generation, the third generation, as it would relate to the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation? The problem the family faced in regard to that generation's participation in the foundation was that the only people truly invested in the cause of mental retardation were her and Sarge's children. After all, it had been their mother's life work for as long as they could remember, and it was also a cause that their father had helped her implement over the years. Of course, the other young Kennedys saw in the cause as valid and important, but it was Aunt Eunice's mission, not necessarily theirs. Eunice realized that one day the situation would probably arise where the foundation would be run by a generation perhaps not so interested in mental retardation, and maybe that would be a battle her children would have to fight. It was eventually decided to establish the Associate Trustees Committee for the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation and automatically enroll the entire third generation in the hope that somehow they would organize themselves into a governing unit. It was their first foray into letting go and sharing power, says Christopher Lawford, Pat's son. It was not easy for them. I remember my Aunt Eunice coming to me before the first meeting and nervously asking if I was going to lead a revolt or try to move the foundation away from mental retardation to something that had more relevance to me and to my generation. I assured her that I wasn't, but that tension was always present. Following the death of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, her children and many of her nieces and nephews have made it their mission to make certain that the cause of mental retardation remains at the forefront, not only of the Kennedy Foundation's interests, but also of their own lives. She would no doubt be very happy about that. In fact, Timothy Shriver, the third of Eunice's and Sarge Five's children, is currently serving as chairman of the board of directors and chief executive officer of the International Special Olympics. Looking back so many years later on this Kennedy uprising, the question does remain: how had Eunice Kennedy Shriver handled it? It could be argued that she could, or maybe should, have been a little more understanding of her siblings. It could be argued that she could, or maybe should, have given them more latitude. In fact, a great many arguments could probably be made against the way she behaved during this bit of a family war. However, her daughter, Maria Shriver, has a favorite saying on a t-shirt that probably sums it up best when it comes to women like Eunice Kennedy Shriver. It says, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." I'm going to skip forward now to page 325, and we'll pick the story up in January of 1991. Ted Kennedy was sitting at a poolside table on a patio of the Kennedys' sumptuous Palm Beach estate with two of the family's attorneys. He looked dreadful. He was overweight by at least 30 pounds. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was unshaven and blotchy. His drinking problem was so serious that he was said to suffer blackouts after a night on the town. On this morning, he was obviously hungover. "I had sex with a couple of knockout hookers last night," he told the lawyers. "I'm not as young as I used to be, though," he said with a chuckle. "But because I think I fell asleep before I finished." The attorneys laughed tensely. Just then, Eunice Kennedy came sweeping into the room. At almost 70, Eunice was now, maybe more than ever, quite the vibrant presence. As she got older, her personality was just as dominant as ever, even if she was physically more frail, no doubt the result of her years-long battle with Addison's disease. That's the same ailment from which her brother Jack suffered. As honorary chairman of Special Olympics International, Eunice was still a very busy woman. This coming summer, in 1991, she was looking forward to the International Special Olympics in Minneapolis. At 75, Sarge was getting older too, but was still involved in many charities despite his bout with prostate cancer. Eunice was actively involved in her children's lives as well. All her children were, not surprisingly, of great service to others. Her eldest, Bobby Shriver, had turned into a fine young man and was now living in Los Angeles and working for the Special Olympics. Anthony was head of a charity called Best Buddies, whose goal was to forge friendships between the handicapped and college students. Timothy was deeply involved in educational charities concerning AIDS prevention and drug addiction. Mark was invested in a social program in Maryland called Choice. Meanwhile, Maria Shriver was doing very well in her television broadcasting career as a newswoman at NBC. As Eunice's only daughter, she spoke to her mother almost every day from her home in Los Angeles. The older Maria got, the more she looked like Eunice. Eunice would make an excellent, if also sometimes quite strict, grandmother to Maria and her husband Arnold Schwarzenegger's children as they came along, 4 in all. Eunice sat down and took her brother in with slanted eyes behind her thick-framed glasses. There she sat, staring at him, not greeting him or anyone else, just staring at him with a stern expression. She had her rosary clutched tightly in one hand and was fingering the beads. When a Kennedy functionary came to the table to ask if she would like some breakfast, Eunice dismissed the servant with a quick wave of her hand, not even glancing in her direction, lest she take her eyes off her brother for even a moment. "Good morning, Eunice," Ted said with a smile, perhaps trying to break the uncomfortable silence of her just sitting there staring at him. "And how is my lovely sister faring on this glorious day?" "Just look at you," Eunice said, ignoring her brother's attempt at levity. "Why, Ted Kennedy, you look a fright." She said she was worried about him and that she knew fully well why he had been drinking. "You want to escape," she told him. "Yes, we have a lot of sad memories, but we can't escape them, Ted. We have to face them." "I know that," Ted said sadly. "As your sister who loves you, I am asking you to please take a good long look at yourself," Eunice said, never softening her steely gaze. "You must change the way you want to be perceived by others and govern yourself accordingly." She then ticked off a list of the public relations disasters that had occurred in the recent past, behind which she suspected was his drinking. She knew about every incident, too, and had a memory for the specifics of each episode that most people would have found pretty amazing. "Jack and Bobby are depending on you, now as always," she said, invoking the names of their dead brothers, which no one ever did in the family unless they meant business. According to the two lawyers present, she also said that there was a whole generation of Kennedys coming up now, many of whom have their own personal dysfunction, and they need you to set an example for them. In fact, this family needs you now more than ever. Ted nodded in agreement. Eunice's commentary had to have made a big impact on him. After all, Ted had done his best to be a strong male influence on 24 Kennedy children, 2 of Jack's, 11 of Bobby's, 4 of Peter Lawford's, and now 4 of Stephen Smith's, not to mention his own 3 children. It had never been easy, but he had done his best, and he had done so despite his tendency to be self-absorbed, which made it all the more a challenge. "My fear is this," Eunice continued. "If you don't straighten up, something terrible is going to happen. All hell is going to break loose again, and by that time we'll all be too damn old to deal with it." Then, rather than soften the blow by saying anything else, Eunice glanced at her watch and exclaimed, "Oh my God, I'm going to be late." And with that, she pushed herself away from the table, rose and walked away quickly, leaving Ted sitting with the 2 attorneys, perhaps embarrassed and maybe even saddened. But that was Eunice. She wasn't the kind of woman who would coddle a person after she let him have it. She wanted the moment to stick, not to be diffused by some meaningless pleasantry. Ted had to know that Eunice was right, and in fact, it would take less than a month for her dire prediction to come true, because Teddy would be involved in the incident at Palm Beach, Easter that year of 1991, along with William Kennedy Smith, who was accused of raping Patricia Bowman there at the Palm Beach estate, which we will talk about in a future episode of After Camelot. And skipping forward now in the book to page 516, under the heading No Regrets. In 2003, Sergeant Shriver, at age 87, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Even though Maria Shriver had referred to her father's disease several times in speeches and interviews over the years, not much is known about its progression in her father's specific case or how the family dealt with it. It was an intensely personal matter. It's never easy to look at your parent and realize that he doesn't know who you are, Maria told Diane Sawyer on Good Morning America in May of 2009. You have to recalibrate yourself every single time you see your father, and you have to introduce yourself to him. Maria said that when she would walk into Sarge's bedroom, she would try to stay upbeat and greet him by saying, "Hi, how are you doing? I'm your daughter, Maria." Typically, his response would be, "Oh my goodness, you are?" And she would then answer, "Yes, isn't that amazing? I'm your daughter." Maria added, "It has taught me to accept a person for who he is in the moment, not for what he used to be or for what I want him to be, but to just deal with the person in front of me. And that's a pretty good lesson for life, just in general." "So be it," Sargent once said when asked about the so-called Kennedy curse. Considering who Sargent had been in his lifetime and his absolute devotion to his Catholicism, there's little doubt but that faith carried him through. At the age of 93, my dad still goes to Mass every day, Maria said when she testified before Congress about the difficulties families face when dealing with Alzheimer's disease. And believe it or not, he still remembers the Hail Mary. For her part, Maria would use her father's terrible illness as a catalyst to make people aware of the ravages of the disease and to eliminate the shame associated with it. In May of 2009, she was the co-executive producer of The Alzheimer's Project, an HBO documentary series that won 2 Emmy Awards. She also wrote a best-selling children's book about Alzheimer's called Grandpa, Do You Know Who I Am? By 2009, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who is now 88, had also been unwell for some time, her body breaking down with the passing of time. The last 6 years of Eunice's life had been extremely challenging as she dealt with a series of strokes at the same time that she was trying to reconcile herself to her husband's deteriorating condition. Ted and Jean were with her as much as possible, especially given the concerns and the demands of Ted's own illness with cancer. It was a difficult time for all of the Kennedys as they faced the prospect of possibly losing 3 of the best of their ranks, Ted, Eunice, and Sarge. After all we've been through, I don't know, you just sort of hope that maybe things might get easier with time, said Jean Kennedy Smith. They don't, though. You really have to persevere. Eunice echoed those sentiments to one of her nursing assistants at this point in her life. Aging can be so cruel, she said. I think now the reason one must be so strong in one's youth is so that it becomes a part of who he or she is as a person, because God knows that when you get older, you need all the strength you can muster just to get through it. It is by no means easy. Then, to this aide, who was at the time in her late 20s, Eunice said, I urge you to do what I did with my life. Do not waste a day. Make every day count. Make it important. That's what I did, and as God is my witness, I have not one regret, not a single one. As her health continued to deteriorate, Eunice became too sick to attend Mass. Therefore, a priest came almost every day to perform the Mass in her bedroom. Her son Timothy recalls, at least, I'm not exaggerating here, 30 separate images of the Blessed Mother in his mom's bedroom. And I mean 30. I don't mean 7 that looks like 30. Eunice Kennedy Shriver died on August 11, 2009, at the age of 88. She was survived by her husband, Sergeant, who was then 93, her 5 children, Anthony, Bobby, Mark, Timothy, and Maria, and 19 grandchildren. In the last few years of her life, I found Mummy to be almost more awe-inspiring than at any time in her 85 years, her daughter Maria said in her moving eulogy of her mother. She who never sat still and was forced to confront stillness, and it was hard for her, but she never complained and she never asked for pity. If you had told me a few years ago at the end of my mother's life she and I would sit in a room and just be, I would have said you were crazy. If you had told me that at the age of 52 I would finally get up the nerve to crawl into bed with my mother, hold her, and tell her that I love her, I would have said you were nuts. And if you had told me that Mummy and I would write poetry together, I would know for sure that you'd lost your mind. But all those things really happened as Mummy learned to let go. Sergeant Shriver would follow his beloved Eunice in death on January 17, 2011. He would be buried with a rosary in his hands, having never lost his faith, even during the darkest of times. Sarge's knowledge of God's love was the structure that supported his public life, Cardinal Donald Wuerl would say at his funeral in Potomac, Maryland. And from this faith, hope, and love flowed his thirst for justice and peace and the courage to speak for those who had no voice. He spoke not from political expediency or correctness, but from an abiding sense of conviction. President Bill Clinton framed it best that day when, in speaking to Sarge, he asked, "Could anybody be as good as he seemed to be? Every other man in this church feels about 2 inches tall right now." But no one could summarize his life better than Sarge himself did in an interview he gave to the Chicago Tribune in July 1987. Quote, "I haven't done everything I wanted to do with my life. I can't say I've been 100% successful, but with respect to the things that count, my marriage, my kids, I've been very, very lucky. I don't know anybody in the world that's been as lucky as I am, period. Think of anybody you've ever read of in any area, politics, business, government, finance. I don't know a single solitary person, not Franklin Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson or John Kennedy or General de Gaulle. I've known all those people. Not one of them, not one, has been as lucky as I have been." 2 weeks after the death of Eunice Kennedy Shriver on August 25th, 2009, Ted Kennedy passed away at the age of 77. And I think I better stop there because my cat just gave me a nudge and said, "Hey, Mom, you've been talking too long." My cat loves to sit up here while I'm doing the book club reading, and he's bumping into the microphone right now. You can probably hear that. You might even be able to hear his purr. But he loves to sit wherever my book is. If you're a cat person, you know what I'm talking about. Whatever you're reading, the cat's got to sit right on top of your book or as close to your book as they can get and just be as adorable and annoying as possible. So I think that's probably a good place to leave it. I hope that this chapter gave you a better understanding of the Shriver end of the family tree and so many of the challenges that they've faced and, in fact, still continue to face to this day with some of their Kennedy cousins and Kennedy in-laws. So until next time, we'll be back soon with another chapter or episode of The Kennedys After Camelot. Till then, take care. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.